The rock was a cold, indifferent tooth against Ada's palm. Each handhold was a negotiation with gravity, a bargain struck between frozen fingers and crumbling shale. Below, the world fell away into a haze of pine and distance, a place they could not return to. Above, the ridge cut a sharp line against the bruised pewter of the dawn sky. Strapped to her back, the weight was a living, breathing thing. A shudder ran through the canvas knapsack, a low whine muffled by the fabric, and Ada gritted her teeth against the answering tremor in her own bones. Jasper! The weight was Jasper, and he was the reason for all of it. For the climb, for the cold, for the ragged burn in her lungs that felt like swallowing shards of ice. She paused, wedging her boot into a crevice, her body plastered to the mountain's face. She could feel the granite's deep, ancient cold seeping through the thin wool of her coat, a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. Beside her, just a few feet away on a slightly more generous ledge, Beatrice watched her, her face a pale, stoic mask. They were twins, but where Ada was motion and muscle, BA was stillness and stone. BA's gaze was fixed not on the summit, but on the pack. Her silence was a question Ada had no answer for. The wind tore at them, a physical blow that threatened to peel them from the rock. It whistled a thin, lonely song, the only sound besides their own ragged breathing and the frantic drumming of Ada's heart. This was the last ascent, the final barrier to the forbidden ravine. Forbidden, the matrons at the orphanage had called it. A place of bad air and lost souls. A place no decent person would ever go. Which was precisely why they were going there. Decency was a currency they had never been able to afford. Ada shifted, the leather straps of the pack digging into her shoulders, a familiar, grounding pain. She risked a glance over her shoulder, down into the valley. A single light burned in the darkness, a pinprick of yellow. The director's office. Mr. Sterling, sitting behind his polished desk, composing another of his reasonable, logical reports. A report that would label them as wayward, ungrateful, and gone. It would not mention the truth. It never did. Beatrice pointed a gloved finger upward. A single, sharp gesture. Onward. Ada nodded, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm her, and reached for the next hold. Her fingers, raw and scraped, found a purchase. She pulled, her muscles screaming in protest. The pack shifted again, a heavier, more worrying slump. Jasper whined again, a sound of pure misery. Hope was a fragile thing, and right now, it was a 70-pound German shepherd shivering with fever, strapped to the back of a girl who was running out of mountain to climb. The top of the ridge was a lie. It was not a flat, welcoming surface, but another series of jagged teeth biting at the sky. They collapsed behind a cluster of wind-stunted junipers, the brittle branches clawing at their clothes. Ada worked at the knots of the pack with numb fingers, her movements clumsy and frantic. She eased the heavy bundle to the ground, laying it gently on the frozen earth. BA was already there, unbuckling the straps, peeling back the canvas flap. Jasper's head emerged, his noble face drawn and tight with pain. His breathing was a shallow, rasping sound that soared at the thin air. He tried to lift his head to lick BA's face, a gesture of lifelong devotion, but the effort was too much. He sank back with a sigh that was almost human. "His worse," BA said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all emotion, which made the words heavier. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, as solid and unforgiving as the rock beneath them. Ada knelt, pressing her forehead against the dog's flank. He was burning up. The fever that had started as a minor cough in the damp, crowded dormitory of the St. Jude Foundling Home had bloomed into a raging fire in his lungs during their frantic, nighttime flight. Mr. Sterling's final edict had been the spark. The animal is a source of contagion. It is a liability. It will be removed for the health and safety of the other children removed. The word was so clean, so sterile. It meant a quick walk to the back of the barn and a single, sharp report. They hadn't even waited for morning. They had packed what little they had, a loaf of bread, a skin of water, 2 blankets, and a dog too sick to walk, and climbed out the window. They had climbed toward the one place no one would follow. The descent into the ravine was worse than the climb up. It was a steep, treacherous gash in the earth, choked with loose scree and tangled roots. But the further down they went, the more the world changed. The howling wind died away, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something green and alive. Moss, thick as a carpet, coated the northern faces of the rocks. Ferns uncurled in sheltered hollows. It was a world hidden within a world. They found the spring at the ravine's floor. It wasn't a trickle, it was a steady, confident pulse of water emerging from a fissure in a wall of black rock, pooling in a deep, clear basin before spilling out to form a creek that vanished into the shadows. The water was so cold it made their teeth ache, but it was the taste of life itself. They drank until they were dizzy, then filled their water skin. Ada carried Jasper to the pool's edge, dipping a strip of cloth into the water and bathing his face, his hot muzzle. He lapped weakly at the wet fabric. It wasn't a cure, but it was something. A small act of defiance against the inevitable. Here, in the forbidden place, was water. In the valley, where the righteous lived, the wells were running low. It was the great irony of their lives. They made their camp in a shallow cave carved by the creek over centuries, its entrance veiled by a curtain of hanging moss. It was damp and smelled of stone, but it was shelter. B.A. laid out their too-thin blankets, making a pallet for Jasper. He collapsed onto it, his breath still a ragged counterpoint to the gentle murmur of the spring. Hope, Ada thought, now sounded like a death rattle. While B.A. sat with the dog, her small, competent hand stroking his fur, speaking to him in whispers too low to carry, Ada went to scout. She did not go far, staying within earshot of the camp, her movements as silent as a shadow. The ravine was a place of secrets. The walls were stratified, telling stories of geologic time in layers of red and ochre and grey. She found animal tracks, deer, rabbit, a fox, but something else, too. A game trail, worn smooth not just by hooves, but by boots. And then, the sign. A length of wire stretched between two saplings, old and rusted. Part of a snare line. But the loop was gone, the trigger mechanism dismantled. Further on, another one, and another. A whole line of traps, all disabled. It was a deliberate act. Someone had walked this path and decided to stop killing. Or to stop providing. It was a presence, but a passive one. A ghost who had given up his haunting. Ada paused, her hand on the cold wire. She felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with being a runaway. They were not alone in this place. The silence was not empty. It was listening. A stick snapped. Not under her own feet. The sound was sharp, definitive, somewhere back toward the camp. Ada froze, every muscle tensing. Her hand went to the small skinning knife at her belt, a tool, not a weapon, but the only thing she had. She moved back the way she came, stepping from stone to stone, making no sound. She parted the curtain of moss. And saw him. He was old. As old as the rocks, it seemed. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his beard a tangle of white and grey. He stood over Jasper, his frame stooped, his hands large and knotted. B.A. was on her feet, a rock in her hand, her body a shield between the man and the dog. But the man was not looking at her. He was looking at Jasper, his expression one of deep, weary concentration. He reached down a slow, deliberate hand. B.A. tensed, ready to throw the rock, to scream, to fight. The old man's hand did not go for the dog's throat. It rested gently on Jasper's ribs, feeling the frantic, shallow movement. He looked up, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue, and his gaze found Ada in the opening of the cave. He showed no surprise. He simply waited. Ada stepped out from behind the moss, the useless knife still in her hand. The man's eyes flickered to it, then back to her face. He did not seem threatened. He seemed tired. He looked back down at the dog. "Lung fever," he said. His voice was a gravelly rumble, like stones shifting underwater. It was not a question. Ada said nothing. In their world, words were traps. You gave them to people and they used them to build a cage around you. The man straightened up, a series of pops and cracks from his joints accompanying the movement. He looked from Ada to Bea, his gaze lingering on their thin coats, their worn-out boots, the hollows under their eyes. He saw it all. The hunger, the fear, the bone-deep exhaustion. He saw the fierce, protective loyalty that bound them together, and to the dying animal at their feet. Most men would have seen runaways, vagrants, a problem to be reported. He saw something else. "He'll die here," the man said, still speaking of Jasper. "The damp will settle in him. Finish him." Ada's grip on the knife tightened. "He's not going to die." The words were a prayer more than a statement, and they sounded thin and foolish even to her own ears. The man grunted, a sound that could have been amusement or contempt. He turned and started to walk away, his gait slow and shuffling. "Then you best come," he said over his shoulder, not looking back to see if they were following. "Fire's the only thing for it now." Ada and Ba exchanged a look. It was the same look they had shared 1,000 times in the orphanage, before a beating, before a theft of food, before a lie they had to tell together. It was a look that weighed risk and reward, trust and terror. This man could be a monster. This ravine could be his larder. But Jasper's breathing was getting shallower. His flank was barely moving. The man stopped and looked back. He wasn't impatient. He was just waiting for them to accept the truth he had already laid out. The truth was that they had no other choice. Love was a liability. Ada sheathed her knife. She knelt and, with Ba's help, worked her arms under Jasper's still form. He was a dead weight now, all warmth and life seeming to have fled. Together, they lifted him. The man watched them struggle, then turned and continued on his path. They followed the stranger's slow, shuffling footsteps deeper into the ravine. His cabin was built into the cliff face, almost invisible until you were upon it. The front wall was a careful construction of river stone and mud, the roof a living thatch of earth and moss. Smoke, thin and grey, curled from a stone chimney, the only sign of its existence from a distance. It was a den, a burrow, a place to hide from the world. He pushed open the heavy plank door and stood aside. The interior was a single room, dominated by a stone hearth where a low fire glowed. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something wild and animal, like old leather. There was a rough-hewn table, a single stool, and a bed piled with furs in the corner. It was the home of a man who had stripped his life down to the essentials of survival. He gestured to the hearth. Put him there. They laid Jasper on the warm stone in front of the fire. The dog sighed, a long, shuddering exhalation, and for the first time in hours, the tension seemed to go out of his body. He was still sick, still dying, but he was warm. The man moved with a slow, practiced economy. He took a clay pot from a hook, filled it with water from a barrel in the corner, and set it on a trivet over the flames. He went to a collection of dried plants hanging from the rafters, crumbling leaves from one, seeds from another, into a small wooden bowl. He ground them together with a stone pestle, the rhythmic thudding the only sound in the room besides the crackle of the fire and Jasper's labored breathing. Ada and Ba stood by the door, unwilling to come further into the small space, unwilling to cede the final ground of their independence. The man paid them no mind. He was focused on his work. He mixed the ground herbs with a dollop of fat from a jar, creating a dark, pungent paste. He scooped a measure of it onto a piece of cloth. "Hold his head," he commanded. Ba knelt by Jasper, stroking his muzzle, whispering to him. Ada watched, her arms crossed, her posture a wall of suspicion. The man knelt beside Ba and gently pried open the dog's jaws. He smeared the paste onto the back of Jasper's tongue. The dog gagged, but swallowed. Then the man took another cloth, soaked it in hot water from the pot, and laid it across Jasper's chest. The steam rose, carrying the sharp, medicinal scent of the herbs. For a long time, no one spoke. The man added a log to the fire. He sat on the stool, his hands resting on his knees, and watched the flames. Ada and Ba remained by the door, two feral creatures hesitating on the threshold of a trap that looked too much like kindness. Finally, The man spoke, his eyes still on the fire. The water brought you, it wasn't a question. We were thirsty, Ada said, her voice clipped. Everyone's thirsty, he rumbled. Down there he jerked his head vaguely in the direction of the valley. But they don't know why. They think it's a dry year. They think it's God's will. He looked at them then, his pale eyes pinning them in place. It's not God. It's Sterling. The name hung in the air, a foul taste. Ada felt a cold dread creep up her spine. You know him? The old man gave a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. I made him, he said. He got up and walked to a rickety chest in the corner. He lifted the lid and pulled out a long, leather-bound book. He laid it on the table, the pages yellowed and brittle. It was a surveyor's ledger. He opened it to a page filled with spidery, meticulous script and a detailed map. 30 years ago. I was the one who found this spring. The source. The heart of the whole watershed. He tapped a point on the map with a gnarled finger. I worked for the land company. My report was supposed to go to the territorial office. But you're Mr. Sterling, he was just a young man then. Ambitious. He had a vision. An orphanage. The word was poison on his tongue. He said the land he'd bought was perfect, but it was dry. He needed water. He paid me for this book. Paid me to file a different report. One that said this ravine was unstable, the water sour. Forbidden. He looked at the sisters, his face a mask of ancient guilt. He built his legacy on my lie. And I built this cabin to hide from it. For 3 days, they lived in that small, smoky room, suspended in time. The world shrank to the crackle of the fire, the rhythm of Jasper's breathing, and the old man's quiet, methodical care. His name was Owen. He never offered it. B.A. asked him on the second day, and he had looked surprised, as if he hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. He showed them how to change the hot compresses on Jasper's chest, how to brew the bitter tea that broke his fever. He shared his food without comment, a thin stew of dried meat and foraged roots, hard biscuits that scraped the throat. It was the food of survival, not pleasure. Ada watched him, her suspicion slowly eroding under the weight of his steady, unassuming decency. He never asked about the orphanage. He never asked why they had run. He seemed to know, in his bones, what kind of place it was, because he was its first secret. His guilt was a living thing in the cabin, as present as the smell of smoke and herbs. It was in the way he tended the dog with a devotion that was a form of penance. On the third morning, Jasper lifted his head. He looked at B.A., and a faint thump, thump, thump of his tail stirred the furs. He was weak, his coat dull and matted, but his eyes were clear. The fire in his lungs had been banked. Hope, which had been a guttering ember, flared. B.A. buried her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ada felt a knot in her own chest loosen, a knot she hadn't realized was there. Later that day, as Owen was outside splitting wood, Ada took the ledger from the table. She sat by the fire, the warmth on her face, and turned the brittle pages. The maps were beautiful, intricate things, lines and numbers that translated the solid world into a language of pure information. She couldn't understand the calculations, but she understood the map of the ravine. She understood the X that marked the spring. And she understood the other map, the one of the valley below. She saw the lines that showed the creeks that should have been flowing, the wells that should have been full. Owen had not just mapped the ravine, he had mapped the consequences of his lie. He returned, his arms full of wood, and saw her with the book. He said nothing, just stacked the logs by the fire. He's diverting it, Ada said, her voice low. Sterling. Owen nodded, he's back to her. A little at a time. For years. A new pipe for the laundry. An irrigation ditch for his charity garden. He tells the town council it's for the orphans. No one says no to the orphans. She turned, his face grim. He owns the high ground. He owns the water. And he's choking the whole valley. Slow and quiet he looked at Jasper, now sleeping peacefully by the fire. He's a good man, you're Mr. Sterling. The whole town says so. The sarcasm was as sharp and cold as a winter wind. That was when the sound came. A sharp whistle from the mouth of the ravine. Not a bird. Human. Owen froze, his hand hovering over the woodpile. Ada was on her feet, her hand instinctively going to her belt. B.A. gathered Jasper closer, her body a protective curve. Owen held up a hand for silence. He moved to the door and peered through a tiny crack in the wood. He stood there for a long moment, then turned back, his face pale. "The bailiff," he whispered. "Sterling's man. He comes once a season. To make sure the spring is still a secret." The man who entered the cabin was nothing like Ada had expected. He was not a thug, not a brute hired for his muscle. He was young, clean-shaven, and wore a coat that was worn but well-kept. He looked more like a clerk than a hired hand. His eyes, however, were old. They held a deep, settled sadness. He took off his hat, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the scene with a practiced, weary efficiency. He saw the old man, the two young women who were clearly not his kin, and the big German shepherd sleeping by the fire. His eyes, drawn by some flicker of recognition, lingered on the open ledger on the table. He did not seem surprised. He seemed resigned, as if he had been walking toward this moment for a very long time. His name was Reese. He introduced himself in a quiet, careful voice, the voice of a man who has learned that words are currency and he is perpetually poor. "Owen," he said, a simple acknowledgement. He nodded to Ada and B.A. "Sterling said you were gone," he said to them. "He said you ran off." "Ungratefuls, we're not his property," B.A. said, her voice shaking but defiant. Reese looked at her, and for a second, a flicker of something, empathy, maybe even admiration, crossed his face. He looked at the ledger. "He sent me to check the flow. The town is putting pressure on him. The farmers at the low end of the valley are threatening to sue the water company," he sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Which is him, of course. He sits on the board." He walked over to the table and looked down at Owen's meticulous map, at the truth of the water laid bare. He traced the path of the hidden spring with his finger, then the paths of the dry creeks below. He knew. He must have known, or at least suspected, for years. He was the one who walked the land. He was the one who saw the lies firsthand. "My daughter," he said, his voice dropping so low they had to strain to hear him. "She was sick last winter. The fever. The doctor said we needed clean water to boil for the steam. Our well was low. Muddy. We had to buy water. From Sterling's company." He stopped, swallowing hard. The story ended there. He didn't need to say the rest. His grief was a physical presence in the room, thicker than the smoke. He looked at Jasper, sleeping peacefully. He looked at Owen's ledger. He looked at the two sisters, fierce and fragile, who had risked everything for the animal at their feet. He had a choice. He could do his job. He could report what he had found. He could drag them all back down to the valley and hand them over to the reasonable, logical cruelty of Mr. Sterling. Or he could not. He walked to the door and paused, his back to them. "The spring is running low," he said to the empty air. "There's been a rock slide. It's almost blocked. That's what I'll report." He put on his hat. He did not look back. "It will take them weeks to organize a party to clear it. If they ever do." He stepped outside. A moment later, he reappeared in the doorway, tossed a small leather pouch onto the floor, and was gone. Inside the pouch was a small bottle of quinine and a folded paper packet of refined medicinal powder. For fevers. The bailiff's visit shattered the timeless peace of the cabin. It brought the outside world, with all its dangers and deadlines, crashing in. Reese's lie had bought them time, but it was a finite resource. Weeks. Maybe a month. Then Sterling would send someone else, someone less burdened by a conscience. The question hung in the smoky air: what now? They could run again, push deeper into the mountains, but winter was coming. They could not run forever. And they would be leaving the valley, and Owen's 30-year-old secret, to Sterling's mercy. There was no mercy. Owen sat at his table, staring at the ledger, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. He had spent a lifetime hiding from this book, and now it was the only weapon he had left. "He'll call me a liar," Owen said, his voice rough with disuse. "A crazy old hermit." "No one will believe me, B.A., and I will," Ada said. She stood beside him, her hand resting near the book. "We know what he is, 2 runaway orphans and a crazy old man," Owen scoffed, the old fear settling back into his bones. "Will be a fine spectacle for the town council." It was B.A. who spoke, her voice clear and steady. She had been quiet for days, a silent witness, but now she found her words. "And a bailiff who lies on his report," she said, looking at Ada. "And a dog that should be dead." She knelt and stroked Jasper's head. He was on his feet now, shaky but whole, his presence a solid, undeniable fact. He was their miracle. "We have the book," B.A. continued, her gaze unwavering. "We have the truth." It was not a plan of attack. It was a plan of revelation. They would not fight Sterling with force. They would fight him with a story. Owen's story, written in the ledger. Their story, written in the scars on their hands and the fever in their dog. They would walk back down into the valley, not as fugitives, but as witnesses. They spent the next day preparing. Owen packed his ledger into an oilcloth satchel. Ada and B.A. packed their few belongings. There was little to take. They left the blankets for the cabin, a small offering to the place that had saved them. The climb out of the ravine was different. The mountain was just as steep, the rocks just as sharp, but their steps were lighter. They were not fleeing something anymore. They were walking toward it. Jasper walked beside them, his gait still a little stiff, but he did not falter. He was the physical manifestation of their purpose, a furry, 4-legged piece of evidence. When they reached the ridge and looked down into the valley, the world looked different. It was no longer a place of just fear and oppression. It was a community of people being slowly poisoned by a lie. Their home. For the first time, it felt like it might be. They did not go to the orphanage. They walked straight to the town, to the small clapboard building that served as the courthouse and meeting hall. It was a Tuesday. Town council meeting day. The meeting hall was half full, a collection of farmers with worried faces and shopkeepers with tight mouths. They were discussing the water rationing, their voices a low grumble of frustration and fear. At the front of the room, seated at a long table with the mayor and 2 other councilmen, was Mr. Sterling. He looked exactly as Ada remembered, impeccable in a dark suit, his face a mask of calm, paternal concern. He was not speaking. He was listening, his posture radiating a deep, unhurried patience. He was letting them exhaust their anger, letting them feel the depth of their helplessness, before he offered his solution. The solution, Ada knew, would involve more sacrifice from them and more control for him. "The rains have failed us," the mayor was saying, his words heavy with resignation. "We must all do our part, tighten our belts." A farmer stood up. "Tighten our belts? My corn is dust. The creek that feeds my pasture is a dry bed. But the pipes that feed the foundling home, they seem to be running just fine." A murmur of agreement went through the room. Sterling raised a hand, and the room quieted. His power was in his composure. "Gentlemen, please," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "The needs of the orphans are paramount. Are we a community that would let our most vulnerable suffer?" He let the question hang in the air, a beautiful, guilt-laden trap. That was when Owen walked in. All eyes turned to the door. The sight of the old hermit, thought by most to be long dead or gone, caused a ripple of shock through the hall. He was stooped, his clothes were worn, but his eyes were clear. He walked slowly to the front of the room, leaning on a rough walking stick. Ada and B.A. followed a few paces behind him, with Jasper heeling at Ada's side. Sterling's face, for the barest fraction of a second, lost its composure. A flicker of something cold and ugly passed through his eyes before the mask of benign authority snapped back into place. "Owen," he said, his voice laced with a perfect blend of pity and warning. "It's good to see you, old friend. But this is a private meeting, it's a public meeting, Owen said, his voice stronger than Ada had ever heard it. And I have public business. He looked not at Sterling, but at the farmers, at the mayor. You think you're in a drought. You're not. You're being robbed. He told his story. He told it simply, without drama, his voice cracking with an emotion that was not weakness, but a lifetime of shame. He spoke of the survey, the spring, the lie he was paid to tell. When he was finished, the room was silent. Sterling laughed. It was a gentle, disappointed sound. My friends, he said, shaking his head sadly. This is what I have protected you from. The ravings of a disturbed and lonely man. Owen's mind, sadly, left him many years ago. The mayor nodded sympathetically. The farmers looked confused, unsure what to believe. The story was too wild. The man telling it was a ghost. Sterling had won. But then Ada stepped forward. She did not speak. She walked to the table and placed the oilcloth satchel in front of the mayor. He hesitated, then unwrapped it. He pulled out the ledger. He opened it. The intricate maps, the columns of figures, the precise script, it did not look like the work of a madman. Sterling's smile tightened. An old diary. Full of fantasies. From the back of the room, a young man stood up. It was Philip, Sterling's own clerk. A quiet, nervous boy who spent his days copying Sterling's letters. He walked to the front. Sir, he said to the mayor. I can read a surveyor's ledger. My father was 1 inch. Philip took the book. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. He traced the lines with his finger. He looked at the map of the ravine, then at the map of the valley's water table. He looked up, his face ashen. He looked at Sterling, who stared back at him with eyes like chips of flint. Philip looked at the mayor. He swallowed. They're real, he whispered. Then louder, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. They're real. This is a survey. A proper 1 inch. The lie, so carefully constructed, so patiently maintained for 30 years, shattered. It was not a loud explosion. It was a quiet, devastating crumble. Ada looked at Sterling. His face was a blank. The mask was gone, and there was nothing underneath. She finally spoke. The water is for everyone. The aftermath was not a storm, but a slow, rising tide. Sterling was not dragged away in chains. His power did not vanish overnight. It began to erode, grain by grain. An official inquiry was launched. The territorial office sent its own surveyors, who, with Owen's ledger as their guide, confirmed everything. The town council, embarrassed and angry, rescinded the Foundling Home's exclusive water rights. Sterling resigned from his position on the water company board, citing health concerns. He remained at the orphanage, a king in a shrinking kingdom, his reputation turning to dust in the mouths of the people who had once praised him. He was a prisoner of the truth. For Ada and Bea, the world changed in small, profound ways. They were no longer runaways. They were the girls who brought the water back. The farmer whose corn was dust offered them a job, and then, seeing their competence and their fierce desire for their own ground, he offered them a deal. A small, overlooked plot of land at the edge of his property, right where the creek from the ravine re-emerged into the sunlight. It wasn't a gift. They would work for it, clearing the stones, planting a garden, building a life from the soil up. It was better than a gift. It was a stake in the world. Owen moved his few possessions from the ravine to a small room they built for him onto the side of their new, tiny cabin. He was teaching them the land's real language, the names of the plants, the habits of the animals, the turn of the seasons. His guilt had been transformed into a quiet, purposeful legacy. Reese, the bailiff, lost his job as he knew he would. But the town, reorganizing its water management, needed a man who knew the land and could be trusted. He was hired to oversee the fair distribution of the very water he had once been paid to ignore. His soul, which he had thought lost, was given back to him. One evening, months later, Ada and Bea stood on the small porch of their half-finished cabin. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of orange and deep purple. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut pine and damp earth. Below them, the creek, their creek, chuckled over the stones. Jasper lay at their feet, his head on his paws, his flank rising and falling in the easy rhythm of a dog at peace. They were not safe, not completely. The world was still a hard place. Winter was still coming. But for the first time, they were not just surviving. They were building. The fear that had been their constant companion for 18 years had receded, leaving in its place a quiet, tentative hope. It was a hope they had earned, one handhold, one truth, one act of defiant kindness at a time. They had gone into the forbidden ravine as fugitives. They had come out as founders.